Scientists say they found human DNA from a fossil that's 400,000 years old. Until now, the oldest known DNA went back a mere 100,000 years old.
What really happened to the Neanderthals? For decades, the story was simple. They were a failed European experiment, a dead-end branch of humanity. But that story was wrong. In 2025, archaeologists unearthed a shocking new site that finally cracked the Neanderthal mystery wide open.
Using the science of DNA, we begin to realize, hey, there was a lot of mating that went back and forth between Neanderthals and humans.
The discovery proves their true origin was a massive, tangled web of migrations. But here's the catch. The evidence shows they weren't alone. This new find reveals a secret history of ancient rivals and strange hybrids that changes everything we thought we knew about our own family tree. A new find rewrites history. Then, in early 2025, everything changed. A joint archaeological team working in a remote, high-altitude region of the Caucasus Mountains found a new cave system. They were following satellite maps that hinted at collapsed underground structures. They named it Zarya Cave, or Dawn Cave, because it was about to shed light on the dawn of humanity. This cave was special. It had been sealed off by a massive rock slide for at least 30,000 years. This created a perfect time capsule, safe from weather, animals, and later humans. What they found inside wasn't just a Neanderthal, but a whole detailed story. The cave floor was a layer cake of history, stretching down over 20 feet, and in at least 5 distinct, undisturbed layers, they found Neanderthal remains. But here's the catch. The DNA from these different layers told a shocking story that rewrote the textbooks on the spot. The oldest remains, from a layer dated to around 100,000 years ago, were genetically similar to the classic Neanderthals found way over in Western Europe in places like France and Spain. This made sense. But the layer directly above that one, dated to around 80,000 years ago, showed DNA that was a near-perfect match for the Neanderthals found in Siberia, in the Altai Mountains, thousands of miles to the east. It was a totally different branch of the family. And get this, a thin layer in between those two showed individuals who were a genetic mix of both groups. Basically, this one cave proved in perfect high-definition detail what scientists had only suspected. The Neanderthals weren't one static group. They were a massive, swirling population. They were a braided river. The Zarya Cave was a grand central station for the Neanderthal world. It was the final, undeniable proof that their origin wasn't a single place. Their homeland was the entire continent of Eurasia. Groups from the west moved in, lived there for a few thousand years. Then as the climate shifted, groups from the east moved in and replaced them. Then they mixed. Then another wave from the west came back. This 2025 discovery wasn't just another fossil. It was the key. It was the Rosetta Stone for Neanderthal genetics. It finally solved the mystery by proving that we'd been asking the wrong question. It wasn't where did they come from? It was how were they all connected? This new find forced us to throw out the old simple story and look at the real one. A story that's far more complex and frankly far more interesting than the simple-minded caveman we all thought we knew. But to understand why this discovery was such a bombshell, you have to understand the old broken story we were told for over 100 years. How did we get it so wrong for so long? The flawed skeleton that fooled science. The very first sign of these ancient people was found all the way back in 1829 in Belgium, a child's skull. Then again in 1848 at Gibraltar. But nobody knew what they were. They were just strange. They were put in museum drawers and labeled as curiosities. The story doesn't really start until 1856. This was just a few years before Charles Darwin published his world-changing book on evolution. In the Neander Valley in Germany, workers at a limestone quarry were clearing out a cave. They found a strange, thick skullcap and some heavy bowed limb bones. They thought it was a bear, or maybe they figured it was a deformed modern human. One of the most famous scientists in Germany at the time, Rudolf Virchow, looked at the bones. His conclusion? It was a lost Russian Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars. Just a few decades earlier, he said the man had been sick with rickets, which bowed his legs. And the huge, thick brow ridge? Virchow said that was just from the soldier frowning all the time in pain. Yeah, about that, they were way off. It was an Irish geologist named William King who first stood up and said the words, "This is a new ancient human species." He named it Homo neanderthalensis, meaning human from the Neander Valley. And that's when the trouble started. See, people in the 1800s were not comfortable with this. They were just getting used to the idea of evolution. They wanted to see themselves, Victorian-era humans, as the perfect final endpoint of creation. So when they looked at these bones, they didn't see a cousin. They saw a monster. They saw a failure, a brutish missing link that proved how far we had come, but the real damage was done in 1908. A nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found in a cave called La Chapelle aux Saints in France. This was a huge deal. A full skeleton could finally tell us what they really looked like. The bones were given to a top French scientist named Marcelin Boule to study the problem. Marcelin Boule had a strong bias. He wanted to prove that Neanderthals were not in our direct line. He wanted them to be a shuffling dead-end ape, and the skeleton he was studying, well, it was perfect for his theory. It was an old man, and he had been suffering from severe, crippling arthritis. His spine was curved, his joints were swollen and deformed. He had also lost most of his teeth. Boule took this one sick, elderly individual and presented him to the world as what all Neanderthals looked like. His official drawing, which was printed in newspapers and textbooks for the next 50 years, was a sensation. It showed a hunched, shuffling, ape-like creature. He had a jutting head, a thick neck, and Boule even gave him a grasping big toe like a chimpanzee, which the skeleton did not have. This was the birth of the caveman, the brute, the dumb, club-dragging animal. This single wrong-headed drawing poisoned our view for a century. We thought they were stupid. We thought they were violent. We thought they were basically animals that we, the smart Homo sapiens, rightfully replaced. The crazy part is, the evidence to prove Boule wrong was right there in the skeleton he was studying. What most people don't realize is that old man from La Chapelle, he had lost his teeth years before he passed away. He couldn't chew. He was crippled by arthritis. He couldn't have hunted. He couldn't have even walked very well. So how did he live? He lived because someone fed him. Someone was preparing soft foods for him, maybe even chewing his food for him. He was being cared for. He was an elder who was respected and kept alive by his group. That's not a brute, that's a community, that's compassion. And then there's the brain size. Everyone's obsessed with our big brains. Well, on average, the Neanderthal brain was bigger than the Homo sapiens brain. Their brain case held about 1,500 cubic centimeters, while ours is around 1,350. Bigger doesn't always mean smarter in the way we think. It might have been for better vision or body control, but it definitely means they weren't simple. As archaeologists kept digging through the 20th century, the brute myth started to crack little by little, and what they found changed the story completely. The dumb brute was a lie. The real Neanderthal was something else. The caveman's hidden mind. So the old story of the dumb European brute was falling apart. We now had a picture of a complex, successful, and widespread human, and the more we looked, the smarter they got. First, let's talk about their tools. We used to think of them banging rocks together. Not even close. Neanderthals created a highly advanced toolkit called the Mysterian industry. These weren't just sharp rocks. These were specialized, crafted tools. They would take a big piece of flint and carefully chip away at it to prepare a core. Then with one perfectly aimed strike, they could knock off a finished tool, a spear point, a scraper, a knife. This is a huge deal. It's called the Levallois technique, and it's like a 3D puzzle. You have to be able to see the finished tool inside the rock before you even start. This takes planning, abstract thought, and incredible skill. They were making standardized tools, which they taught from one generation to the next for over 200,000 years. And what did they do with those tools? They hunted. We had this idea that they were just cowardly scavengers stealing leftovers from lions. The new evidence shows they were the top predator of Ice Age Europe. They weren't just hunting rabbits, they were taking down megafauna. We're talking mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant cave bears, and massive bison. These are animals that could weigh tons. You don't do that with a club and a grunt. You do that with teamwork, planning, and complex communication. They would likely have used the landscape, driving herds of animals into pits or over cliffs, and they used spears, not throwing spears, but heavy close-quarters thrusting spears. Think about that. It means they had to get right up next to a struggling 10,000-pound mammoth to make the final move. This wasn't just smart, it was incredibly brave, but it wasn't all about hunting. They had a culture. For a long time, we thought Homo sapiens were the first to have any kind of spiritual life. The evidence says no. All across Eurasia, we find Neanderthal burials. At sites like La Ferricie in France, they found a whole family, a man, a woman, and several children, all placed in specially dug pits. In one case, a child was buried under a large flat stone that seems to have been carved with small cup-like marks. And then there's Shanidar Cave in Iraq. This is a famous one. In the 1950s, archaeologists found a skeleton, Shanidar IV, who was buried in a shallow grave. And the soil samples from around his body were full of pollen. Not just random pollen, but clumps of pollen from colorful medicinal flowers. The archaeologist who found it, Ralph Selecki, argued this was a flower burial, that these tough hunters had a soft side, gathering flowers to bury their friend. Now, it's not that simple, though. In recent years, some scientists have argued that burrowing rodents might have dragged the flowers in. But the thing is, even if you take away the flowers, the burials themselves are real. They were intentionally placing their relatives in the ground, protecting them. This shows they had a concept of death. They had a sense of loss and ritual. And then, the biggest shock of all, art. We always said art was our thing. It's what makes us human. In 2018, a study blew that idea out of the water. In a series of caves in Spain, scientists found art that was way older than any Homo sapiens art. In one cave, Cueva de los Aviones, they found seashells with holes drilled in them. They were covered in pigment, bright red and yellow ochre. This is jewelry. This is a necklace. In another cave, they found hand stencils on the wall, and in a third, painted lines making a ladder shape. They used new dating techniques on the thin layer of rock that had formed over the paint. The verdict? The paintings were at least 64,000 years old. This was a bombshell. Homo sapiens weren't even in Spain 64,000 years ago. The only people who could have done it were Neanderthals. They were making art. They were wearing jewelry. They were thinking in symbols. They were not brutish animals, they were human. So this just led to a new mystery. If they were so smart, so successful, and so widespread, where did they begin? And that's when science got a brand new tool that would blow the whole thing wide open. The key wasn't just in the bones, but hidden inside them. The Spanish pit of bones. For a long time, all scientists had were the bones. They would measure the skulls, look at the brow ridges, and try to build a family tree. Based on the fossils, the oldest proto-Neanderthal bones, the ones that were starting to look like Neanderthals, seemed to be in Europe. So the story was still they came from Europe. But in the late 1990s and 2000s, a new field of science basically exploded onto the scene: ancient DNA. A Swedish biologist named Svante Pääbo, who would later win a Nobel Prize for this, was pioneering ways to pull tiny, broken fragments of genetic code out of fossils that were tens of thousands of years old. It's not that simple, though. Ancient DNA is a nightmare to work with. First, it breaks down. Over thousands of years, the long, delicate strands of DNA shatter into millions of tiny, unreadable pieces. Second, it gets contaminated. A single skin cell from the archaeologist who finds the bone, or a single bacterium that lived in the soil for 40,000 years, can completely overwhelm the actual ancient DNA. For years, the work was slow and full of false starts. But the technology got better and better. They learned to work in clean rooms like a sci-fi movie, wearing full-body suits to avoid contamination. They developed new computer programs that could take millions of tiny, broken DNA fragments and stitch them back together, like the world's hardest jigsaw puzzle. And the first place they hit a major puzzle was a site in northern Spain called Cima de los Huesos. This means the pit of bones. And that's putting it lightly. It's a deep, cold, muddy chamber at the bottom of a 50-foot deep vertical shaft. And in that mud, scientists found the jumbled remains of at least 28 different individuals. They were dated to around 430,000 years ago. When they looked at the bones, they were stunned. They looked like early Neanderthals. They had the thick brow, the strong jaws, the facial structure. This looked like the birthplace. This was the European origin we were looking for, but then in 2013 they pulled the DNA and the results made no sense. They first managed to get mitochondrial DNA. That's the small bit of DNA you only get from your mother's line. They ran the test and it wasn't Neanderthal, it was Denisovan. Who? Denisovans were a totally different, mysterious group of ancient humans who were thought to only live in Asia, thousands of miles away in Siberia. How did these Spanish fossils, which looked Neanderthal, have DNA from a group in Siberia? It was a complete contradiction. A few years later, the tech got even better and they were able to pull nuclear DNA from the Sima bones. That's the DNA you get from both parents, the main code. They ran the test again. This time, the nuclear DNA was clearly 100% early Neanderthal. So, here's the deal. These 400,000-year-old people were Neanderthals, but they carried a ghost signal from a different group in their maternal line. What did this mean? Did an early wave of humans from Asia come to Europe and mix? Did the Sima people's ancestors come from Asia? The simple European story was now officially totally broken. The second big shock came from the other side of the world, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. In a place called Denisova Cave, yes, the same cave where they found the Denisovans, they also found Neanderthal bones. When they got the DNA from the Altai Neanderthal, it showed two things. First, these individuals were clearly Neanderthals, related to the ones in Europe. This was mind-blowing. It meant their range wasn't just Europe and the Middle East, it stretched all the way across Asia. That's a territory of thousands of miles covering massive mountains, frozen plains, and dense forests. Second, the DNA showed that the Altai Neanderthals had split off from the European Neanderthals a long time ago, maybe 150,000 years before they were like two long-lost branches of the same family. But the most shocking detail from the Altai DNA was about the individual. The genome showed she was highly inbred. Her parents were very close relatives. We're talking maybe half-siblings or an uncle and a niece. This painted a new, sad picture. It suggested that at least some Neanderthal groups were tiny, isolated, and struggling to find partners. So now scientists had two main branches, a Western group in Europe and an Eastern group in Siberia. And they had the Sima puzzle, which hinted that the whole story was tangled up with other groups, like the Denisovans, right from the very beginning. This set up the biggest question. How did these groups stay connected? And how did they all end up in the same family when they were so far apart? The answer, it turns out, was in the ice, and it opened the door to theories so wild they sound like science fiction. Did they really disappear? This is where the 2025 Zarya cave discovery comes back in. It was the key that unlocked this whole mess. The reason the Spanish bones had weird DNA and the reason there were Neanderthals in Siberia was what scientists now call the braided river hypothesis. What most people don't realize is the Ice Age wasn't just one long, cold winter. It was a crazy, unstable cycle. For thousands of years, it would get bitterly cold. Massive ice sheets, thousands of feet thick, would spread down from the north. Then for a few thousand years, it would get warmer. Sometimes even warmer than it is today, the ice would melt back. This cycle was the engine of Neanderthal history. When the ice advanced, it pushed all life south into refuges, places like Spain, Italy, and the Caucasus. Then, when the ice retreated, it opened up new land. Vast green corridors full of animals would appear. The Neanderthal bands would follow these herds. The Zarya cave proved this was happening. It was a refuge and a crossroads. A group from the west, Europe, was pushed there. Then a group from the east, Siberia, was pushed there. They met, they mixed. Then one group took over. It was a constant flow of genes, a massive pulse of migration for hundreds of thousands of years. Their origin wasn't a place, it was a process. And it gets even crazier. Because the Neanderthals weren't the only humans on this giant icy highway. We go back to that cave in Siberia, Denisova. This place is one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, because in it, scientists found the remains of three different kinds of humans. They found the Altai Neanderthals. They found us, Homo sapiens. And in 2010, they found a tiny piece of a pinky bone from a young girl. When they tested its DNA, it wasn't Neanderthal and it wasn't Homo sapiens. It was something brand new. They named this group the Denisovans. These are a true ghost population. We still don't know what they looked like, but they were all over Asia. So you have these three human groups all walking the same Ice Age highways, all following the same mammoth herds, and all sometimes using the same cave. Did they meet? In 2018, scientists announced the single most shocking discovery of all. It was another tiny bone fragment from Denisova Cave. They pulled the DNA. The person it belonged to was a hybrid. They named her Denny. She was a girl about 13 years old, and her genes showed clear as day that she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. This was a bombshell. This was the first time anyone had ever found a first-generation hybrid. It was proof that these groups were meeting and having children. They weren't just rivals, they were part of the same tangled human family. This new complex picture has opened the door to some wild theories. Theories that were once laughed at, but that now seem a little more plausible. Wild Theory 1. Did they talk? We thought they just grunted, but when scientists found a Neanderthal hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the tongue, it looked exactly like ours. And get this, when they cracked the Neanderthal genome, they found they have the same FOXP2 gene, which is absolutely critical for human language. What if they weren't silent? What if they had complex songs, stories, and languages? Wild Theory 2. Were they builders? We thought they just lived in caves. But in France, in Bruniquel Cave, archaeologists had to go deep underground. Over 1,000 feet from the entrance, in total darkness, there someone had broken off over 400 stalagmites, and they had arranged them in two giant, perfect circles. They also built small piles of them, and they had burned fires on them. They used new dating techniques. The structures are 176,000 years old. Homo sapiens weren't in Europe yet. It had to be Neanderthals. What was it? A shelter? A ritual site? A temple in the dark? Wild Theory 3. Did they sail? This is a really wild one. For years, archaeologists have found stone tools on the Greek island of Crete, but the tools are old, way old, over 130,000 years old. Here's the catch. Crete has been an island for over 5 million years. The only way to get there is by boat. Homo sapiens weren't there. The tools look Neanderthal-like. Did they build rafts? Did they sail the Mediterranean? The idea is mind-blowing. Wild Theory 4. Did they survive? This is the wildest one of all. The official story is that they vanished about 40,000 years ago. But did they? All across the world, there are legends of wild men in the mountains, the Almas of Central Asia, the Yeti in the Himalayas, Bigfoot in North America. What if some tiny isolated groups didn't get absorbed? What if they just kept hiding? What if these legends are a folk memory or more? These theories are pushing the boundaries, but the final answer to the Neanderthal mystery, the real ending, was waiting in our own DNA. We are the Neanderthals. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals and Denisovans had Eurasia to themselves. They were the main human players in that giant braided river of genes. But meanwhile, back in Africa, our branch of the family, Homo sapiens, was growing. And somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to leave Africa in a big way. We entered the Middle East, which was prime Neanderthal territory, and for the first time, these two human lines, ours and theirs, came face to face. What happened next? For years, the popular idea was a brutal war, us versus them. We were the smart, skinny newcomers with better tools, and we just wiped them out. But the evidence just doesn't support that. There's no widespread sign of some great continent-wide conflict. The real story, which DNA has now proven, is so much more interesting. We met them and we mixed with them. That's right, every single person alive today whose ancestors came from outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. On average, it's about 1% to 2% of your total genome. Some people in East Asia carry even more. If you add up all the different pieces of Neanderthal DNA carried by all humans alive today, it's not 1%. It's estimated that at least 40% of the entire Neanderthal genome is still alive, just scattered in tiny pieces among the billions of us. They didn't just vanish, they were absorbed. They became part of us. This genetic inheritance isn't just a fun fact, it had real-world consequences. When Homo sapiens left Africa, we were entering a new world with new dangers, new climates, new altitudes, and new diseases. Neanderthals had been living in that world for hundreds of thousands of years. They were adapted. By mixing with them, we got a genetic shortcut. We inherited genes that helped us. A huge chunk of the Neanderthal DNA we keep is related to our immune systems. It's the code that helps our bodies identify and fight off viruses and bacteria. We also got genes that changed our skin and hair, making hair thicker and skin paler, which is useful for making vitamin D in parts of the world with less sunlight. But here's the catch, it wasn't all good. We also inherited some baggage. Scientists have now linked Neanderthal DNA to a ton of modern traits. We got genes that make our blood clot faster. This was probably great for a hunter who got cut by a spear point. But today, it means a higher risk for strokes and other serious conditions. We also got genes linked to a higher risk for depression, nicotine addiction, and allergies. That's right. Part of the reason you might sneeze every spring could be because your Neanderthal immune system is too aggressive, overreacting to simple pollen. So, did the Neanderthals really vanish? Or did they just win by becoming a part of the most successful human species on the planet? Let us know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.